I haven't figured out how to do it properly, but I did it in like a wine bar one time and I don't think she could like fully hear me.
Oh no.
So she like thought I was just complimenting her earrings and then I ended up being like...
That's me. I did those. Hi, I'm Stacey Lee Kong, and this is Making Our Own Way, a Friday Things video series about GTA creatives who are finding their own pathways to success. I'm here with Warren Stephen Scott, a fashion designer, and I'm so excited. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Do you remember the first time that you fell in love with fashion?
So what I usually like look back on is like when I realized that there's like people that make like fashion collections and like clothing and it was something I didn't really understand. And I think for a lot of people from like my generation, like millennials, that would have been fashion television.
Yes.
And so I grew up on Vancouver Island and I just remember like randomly like on cable, this like fashion show would like be on and there'd be all these like runway shows and I didn't really like understand what that was. Who were these people at these shows and what are these clothes? And that was the first time that I kind of became like engrossed and like curious on what like fashion is.
Okay, what I think is so interesting too, though, is that you were focused in on the people, because when I not creepily, like, I don't know, when I was doing my research for this interview, I noticed that on your site, you describe yourself as a luxury fashion designer, tailor, and craftsperson. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask why it was important for you to highlight not just the act of design, but the act of making. And to me, that feels connected to the people part.
Yeah, it's great to know like where your clothing comes from, where your jewelry comes from, like who were the hands that made them. Mm-hmm. And now I have my studio in Toronto and everything comes out of there. Like the earrings are produced there. When I produce lines of clothing, all the garments are produced by me, sewn by me. It takes me like a lot longer to like release these collections.
Yeah.
But then I think you kind of have a bit more of an like intimate connection with the person making your clothing.
100%.
Hopefully.
One would hope. Because I don't think I fully understand how often designers are working with seamstresses or tailors. Like people aren't always, or often aren't even, like actually producing their clothes with their own hands.
Yeah, and I think as I figure out what like my business is and what I'm gonna do each year, this is just something that I've like carved out for myself, is that okay, I'm gonna release these like more small collections when I want to. Like I'm not releasing something every season.
Right.
And like on that kind of schedule. So I'm able to like have this kind of relationship with producing clothes at a slower pace. But then I don't know, if say I wanted the business to be bigger, then I'd have to like...
You'd have to rethink that relationship.
Yeah. So
100%.
There's like so many options for people on like what to do, and I'm still trying to figure that out a bit.
But I like framing it as options as opposed to limitations, because I think I almost expected you to be like, you know, that limits my ability to grow, and that wasn't the way that you framed it.
Right. Yeah. I think I kind of want people to know that like there are so many different like avenues you can like take, say like even constructing a garment itself or designing something. Like if multiple designers were like tasked with the same singular design, everyone would have like a different route to like produce like something visually the same.
Right.
So I do kind of like think about that sometimes, and then like each season kind of like informs itself, or each year, okay, this worked like last year, and trying to figure out what's like going to be the model going forward.
Yeah. So I'm the type of person who wants a plan. I want to know what we're doing. I want to know how we're going to execute. And so the idea of like, we are figuring it out as we go, I find a little bit stressful.
Yeah, so I think there's like, for myself, it's like kind of both those stories. I kind of like fell into this, and
Right.
the business has been growing like each year. And something that I kind of need, that some of my mentors have like mentioned to me, is that I do need like a bit more of like a schedule, or like figuring out like
Right.
what works for me.
Yeah.
So that's like the thing I'm trying to introduce to like the business now, is like that's like an area that I'm like lacking.
Okay, tell me how you did get into fashion, because I'm interested to hear how one falls into a career in fashion, because I often think of it as like a hard thing to do.
Well, I don't know. I didn't fall into like the fashion career, but the jewelry business, I kind of think I fell into. So I graduated from fashion school in 2016.
Okay.
And then I was working in the industry for 2 years after that, kind of trying to figure out what I was going to do. And so I think this happens like in a lot of creative fields. Like we go through our programs, and then it's like, okay, what's next?
Now you need a job.
Yeah.
What will it be?
So I was working in retail, and Toronto had like at the time a number of different like fashion weeks. And there was like menswear week, there was an art fashion week, there was Toronto Fashion Week was gone, but then a different iteration came back. And it just kind of seemed a bit like crowded, or almost like, okay, where do I belong amongst all those choices?
Yes.
Because I knew I wanted to create something. And then in 2018, Sage Paul announced the creation of Toronto Indigenous Fashion Arts Festival.
Yeah.
And as soon as I heard that and like saw that, it was a no-brainer that this was the place that I was going to apply to and hopefully showcase my first collection.
Yeah.
So I was one of 23 designers selected for the first year to make a collection. That was like my first kind of going into like designing clothing that was my own voice and own style and aesthetic. So with that, I was designing a collection for the runway for the first time. And so you're like thinking about the whole look. What are people going to see on the runway?
Yeah.
And that kind of led me to be like, okay, I'm not just making garments. What are the shoes? What are the accessories?
Yes.
And so that kind of encouraged me as well to like design these earrings for the runway.
Yeah.
And that's how the first jewelry was designed.
Okay, so I see how you fell into that. But then it seems like these are obviously much more accessible than beautiful, but like artistic and creative and not necessarily practical clothes that are going down the runway.
Yeah.
So from like a business perspective, is this your bread and butter, or what are you relying on?
Yeah, so definitely so after I participated in Indigenous Fashion Week in 2018, I kind of went into that knowing that I was just designing kind of a creative body of work. And then after that was all said and done, I had a pop-up at the store that I used to work for. And they showcased the collection in their front window, and we kind of had a meet and greet. And then we wanted to like have something for customers to kind of like take away from the event, which was, okay, we'll try selling the jewelry.
Yeah.
And that weekend that we had the collection in the window, all the jewelry sold out.
Unsurprising.
And so that was kind of what started the process of me realizing, okay, I can start with jewelry. Like I didn't have the capital to produce a line of clothing.
Right.
Like my studio was my living room.
Yes.
And the clothes that I designed for that show weren't really like meant to go into production.
Yeah.
But I could take on like producing a bit of jewelry, start getting a website up and running, and kind of launching there.
Yeah.
And so I think it was 3 or 4 months after Indigenous Fashion Arts Festival, I launched my website.
Okay. What is the value of having both of those things? Like obviously the earrings are still creative endeavors, but they're far more kind of practical and almost prosaic, whereas you have this other side of your business that is maybe even more creative and more about art.
Right. I wouldn't have been able to produce these like clothing collections and artworks if I didn't have the jewelry.
Right.
And so the whole business of what I do and what I put out there started in 2018. but the first line of clothing wasn't available until 2021.
Right.
So the jewelry has like allowed all these like great things. I can produce more of the jewelry. It can be at a more accessible price point.
Yes.
And then I can take like these sporadic times to produce like other bodies of work, which are the clothing collections and the artworks. So yeah, that has been like, I think, part of the reward of what I do, because I'm not just doing jewelry all the time. I can like take away and have like creative output in different areas, and then kind of makes all areas a bit more successful.
Yeah. Because you're not, I think, I was saying this to someone else, but for a long time I used to think of myself just as like one type of, I could just do magazines. Like that's what I could do. That's what I was good at. And it's only relatively recently that I was like, oh, your skills are transferable, which I'd been saying on resumes for years. Yeah. But like turns out you can do different types of work, and it ends up inspiring you or informing the other things that you always did. Like there is a real value in trying different stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me about your decision not to release on like the traditional season schedule, because I feel like there are 17 more seasons than there were when I was first learning about fashion. And B, that is really going against the grain though.
Yeah, so I think that's really something I'm figuring out, like what works for me. So even like if I do like a promotion for jewelry, like I recently discovered that I like to do like a gift with purchase, but instead of it being something like Boxing Day or some sort of like holiday that's like meant to like
be consumeristic.
Yeah. For the last 3 years, I designed a special earring the month of my birthday, and then I produce like a limited run of those. And so on my birthday, every order comes with like the special gift of an earring. So that I can like give back to the customers who've like allowed this like whole thing to happen.
Yeah.
And that just like makes it a lot more meaningful. Like my birthday has like become this excuse to kind of design something that's like not part of the regular assortment available on my website, a special item, and then I'm able to like have that as like a little event. And so I'm trying to like figure out like what those are throughout the year.
Yes.
So that's been like one of them. And I think with the clothing, it probably does need a bit more structure, like what the timeline.
I want you to have a little bit more structure for my peace of mind, but yes.
So originally I like had thought I'd release a collection of clothing once a year. So I'm just trying to figure out what the most like realistic like option that will be. So it's kind of like I'm releasing collections like when they become available.
In like an organic way.
Yeah.
Sometimes at a surprising time. We're very different people. Okay. How did you develop your aesthetic?
That's like developed over the years. So like one thing that I've like picked up on since that first fashion show was because when we showed that first collection, there were 6 designers showing each night at Toronto Fashion Arts Festival, Indigenous Fashion Arts Festival. And so we all shared the same models.
Right.
And so that also meant like there was quick changes and everyone shared the same makeup and the same hair, and which is all makes sense for like that kind of festival.
Yeah.
But you kind of lose a bit of like the creative
individuality of your.
Yeah. So when you're doing like a group show kind of like that, you kind of lose that a bit. But with that collection, I was referencing all these kind of archival photos that a journalist, Paul Sisakwasis, was kind of presenting on Twitter, and it was all these images of Indigenous people just like living.
Like just living regular lives.
Yeah.
Right.
And with a lot of those photos, there was like a lot of laughter and a lot of smiling especially if there was like multiple people in them.
Yeah.
And so walking down the runway, I decided to have all the girls smiling when they were walking down, because everyone was kind of walking like quite
like serious and fashion-y.
Yeah. but I wanted to reference those photos.
Yeah.
So everyone kind of was like
Smiling
down the runway. And then that has kind of become this like thread
I love that.
in all of the projects that I do. So even like the last lookbook I did, it was all about that as well. Like rather than like having really posed kind of photo shoots and stuff, I wanted to like capture people in conversation.
Yeah.
And then like the photographer is tasked with like capturing those moments in between.
Yes.
And so that's like something that like developed almost organically as well. And then now I'm able to present that like better, or like how I envisioned, now that I've like had 4 years of an experience with that.
Yes. I like the idea too of exploring this theme and exploring this idea and iterating and not getting bored of it, just like finding new opportunities and new ways of telling that story.
Yeah.
Because at the core, you're talking about a really powerful counterpoint to narratives that are around Indigenous people and marginalized people in general, right? Like so much of, especially recently, so much of what we talk about when we talk about Indigenous people in Canada is about pain and oppression and brutality. Yeah. So like the act of focusing on joy and connection is quite revolutionary.
Yeah. Even during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, there was like a lot of support for like e-commerce, Canadian Indigenous businesses, BIPOC businesses.
Yeah.
And so I was having a lot of orders online as everyone was like transitioning to like e-commerce and stuff. But obviously it was like a very hard period for so many people.
Right.
But what I had kind of realized is like when I would like bump into people and see people, what has kind of like happened with my business or like what I do, it is like really positive and people are always like so enthusiastic. And so I guess I feel like a responsibility to like also just like share that with people.
Yeah.
So that's been like kind of like a conscious thing as well, I guess.
No,
Yeah.
I like that. So the fashion industry, I mean, in general, fashion does not have a great reputation for inclusivity and equity. What has it been like to build a career as an Indigenous person and also someone who is going against the grain in certain ways within the Canadian fashion industry?
Yeah, so I think after school, I was trying to really like figure out, okay, I'm interested in starting something on my own. How do I go about doing that?
Yes.
And in some ways I had like assumed that we have to like go about it in these ways of like applying for funding from here or applying for awards here, applying for these like creative
things
and like make these collections and then you get an award for this. And I did kind of start doing that. And even when I started the business, I would like kind of take some time away, build these kind of applications.
Yes.
And pay my friends who were in graphic design or communications to like build these kind of portfolios to apply for these awards and grants. And all of them basically went unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
And I was kind of, I guess, feeling like, okay, I think I'm like gunning after something I'm like prescribed to like think this is like what's supposed to work in order to be a fashion business or to like start out as a fashion brand. So I stopped kind of doing that. And I was like, okay, the only way I'm going to be able to do this is if I am a legitimate business on my own, which meant, okay, do I have customers? Do I have a product that customers can buy? And so I started like shifting instead of like applying for like these awards or this like funding into that kind of approach.
Right.
And to like sustain myself on my own. So that I don't think I would like be sitting here if I didn't like try that. That isn't to say that I haven't had like support from like
no, of course,
community and stuff.
Of course. But I think it is interesting to note that like in order to do it on your own, or in order to sort of do it in this way, there has to be this kind of like self-sufficiency and this like, you can't always play by the rules. Like getting grants is not just about doing good work. It's also understanding the language of grant writing and the like grant ecosystem. And it's going to sort of prioritize a certain type of work and a certain type of business.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily like lining up with what you're doing or what you want to do.
Yeah, so I think it was like unclear to me. It's like, okay, and I don't think that I'm that kind of designer as well that creates like a really creative or what they're after.
Right. No, yes, I know exactly what you mean. Exactly. But even so, from my own experience, just like the types of grants that are out there often prioritize local journalism, which is not what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
So like what grants am I eligible for? It's just like that's what the ecosystem is looking for. And if you're not doing what the ecosystem is looking for, then you have to find another way of doing it.
Yeah.
Which is not to say we never get grants or we never get that support. It just means you kind of make the choice between like, what do I want to do and what is everyone else doing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you kind of got at this where you were talking about in 2020 and 2021, there being a lot of support for e-commerce, a lot of support for BIPOC businesses, especially Indigenous businesses as well.
Yeah.
I'm very interested to hear not just about opportunities that came out of that attention, but like, did that kind of attention bring challenges? Because I feel like sometimes that happens where there is much more mainstream attention on something that we've been maybe paying attention to for a long time.
Right.
And it does bring new business opportunities and things like that, but it also brings like points of friction.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that happened for you.
So I guess like an odd thing that happened a few times
Yes.
would be like, it was like amazing to have like all this support and stuff. But it like came in like various kinds of forms. And so sometimes when maybe some people who like are more like influencery kind of clientele were consuming my work, and then when they would like receive their items, they would like share what they just received and what they just ordered, but they were presenting my work like incorrectly as like a Métis artist or and I am First Nations.
Right.
And so that was like, that happened a few times, and even like different cultural backgrounds, someone like identified me as, and
As in like not First Nations at all?
So that, and
After, I'd like you to give me more details on that. I recognize that maybe we won't do that right now.
so I guess there was kind of like this like performance element maybe for some people, which I just like realized I was not responsible for, like,
No, you're not.
the engagement with that. But that was something that was just, I wasn't expecting to kind of like show up in my DMs.
Definitely not.
So that has definitely been part of it. I think early on as well, like I remember when I had one of my first like major interviews and publications in the first Indigenous fashion show. I was one of 2 designers profiled, but when they were kind of promoting the segment, they weren't presenting like my work, but they were kind of presenting, the visuals were kind of more stereotypical representation. Right. So they wanted like that kind of, those visuals rather than like what
you actually do.
Yeah. So there's been like moments like that as well that have like happened.
Yeah. I feel like that what you're saying about performance is such a major part of it, that like so many times people feel like they should say something or they should have some kind of commentary or whatever, but actually so much of what we should be doing is the listening.
Yeah.
Because then you end up making this misstep that's unintentional, but like also doesn't feel good. So not a win on that. What motivates you to keep doing this work?
So I think something that like so unexpectedly happened was, so say even when I'm like trying to design clothing or jewelry, it is me like alone in the studio, or like you're just like figuring out what the collection is. Or even when I was in school, because I have a bachelor's of design, so I took marketing and I took all these other courses to try to understand like how are you going to like be in the industry, how are you going to run a business. But something I never expected was this kind of like celebration and like enthusiasm from the clientele and the relationship that I've like built with customers, and how like ardent they are, and when they like celebrate someone else like wearing the jewelry, and like all these like this kind of like connection that's like happened is like the like most meaningful thing, because people are like living their day-to-day lives, and events are just like every day in my work, and that's so cool.
No, it's so cool. And I think that's like the nicest part of anything, is knowing that what you're doing is resonating with other people. Cause like, I feel the same way. Sometimes I'm just like, I'm typing at my computer by myself in my kitchen, hoping for the best. And anytime someone's like, oh, that made me think of this in a different way, I'm like, there are other people. There are other people in this world. It's nice. It's a nice reminder.
Yeah. So I think that's like never something I expected. And like, I bump into people on the streets now, or if I see someone wearing my jewelry, I like go and say hello. And
I love that you say hello. But do you go up to them and you're like, listen, do you know who I am? You've never said that in your life.
I haven't figured out how to do it properly, but I did it in like a wine bar one time, and I don't think she could like fully hear me.
Oh no.
So she like thought I was just complimenting her earrings, and then I ended up being like,
that's me. I did those.
But it just turned into like a cute moment.
That's a very cute moment, and also a very funny story. When you're looking at your career so far, what are you most proud of?
Oh gosh. I think like personally, I'm like proud that I can like work for myself like every day and like every month. That's like something that's been like a huge reward. I just did this eyewear collaboration that launched in September.
Mm-hmm.
So I designed a collection for New Look, and they have stores in Quebec, in Saskatchewan, in BC, and so all my family's out in British Columbia.
Right.
And so they have stores in malls across BC. There was like campaign photos with my name and the collaboration, and something that like started happening was like my cousins and like all my family would be like texting my mom photos or sending me photos. And I think now like my family has been able to like be engaged and like understand what I do, and this like and or maybe like have context to it, like seeing that like at the mall in Chilliwack. So that has been like so sweet as well, that my family's been like able to participate in it as well.
I think that's an underrated, powerful thing, a feeling of like, I think it's for me from an immigrant background, where my job is not the kind of job that it's easy for you to understand if you didn't grow up in this world. And like, I did not, and my family definitely did not. So when it was like, oh, she's writing these articles for this place and I can buy that magazine on the newsstand and see her name, like that's very powerful, versus like, I don't know, she writes these things, she's typing all the time. Like that moment of connection and understanding is so powerful, because you're like, oh yeah, no, we're doing this.
Yeah.
We're doing this, and you get it and you can see it and you understand it.
Yeah.
So I like that. Is there anything going on with you, anything that's coming up next, or like other things that you wanted to promote or call out in addition to the eyewear line?
So next will probably be like another clothing collection, which the date is unknown.
Have you designed it yet?
It's partially designed.
Okay.
But yeah, I think after doing all this work and having like years of production and getting to this point where I am, last year was kind of like about stabilizing and just like actually enjoying like that I have a studio all of my own now, and that this is like legitimate, and like just balancing that.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm like kind of getting more into that like creative zone and trying to figure out what that collection is going to be. But yeah, that's the next major project.
I'm very excited to see it. Thank you so much for being here and for chatting with me. I was so excited when you said yes, so I'm really pleased that we got to do this.
No, I am too. Thank you.
Okay.
Advice for young Indigenous people wanting to get in fashion is, I think we'll always have like goals of where we like see ourselves in the future, but there's not like one lane or one route into getting there. And I came from this like creative background, multidisciplinary program, but when I was in school, I took a jewelry course, but I wasn't thinking I was going to be a jewelry designer. And somehow that's like where I ended up first. And that's because I allowed myself to like kind of figure out what's happening each month, each year, and figure out what that plan is, what that route is, and letting that kind of guide me. So just be open to possibilities.